my great pleasure to mediate today's presentation and to introduce to you Dr. Marko Andryczyk, our man in all things Ukrainian literature. Dr. Andryczyk defended his PhD in Ukrainian literature at the University of Toronto in 2005, and his monograph, The Intellectual as a Hero in the 1990s, Ukrainian Fiction, was published by the University of Toronto Press in 2012. A Ukrainian edition of that monograph, Intellectual як Герой, was published by Pyramida in 2014. Dr. Andryczyk is a translator of Ukrainian literature into English, and there are not very many of such specialists even now. So, in 2008, 2016, he organized the Contemporary Ukrainian Literature series, co-sponsored by the Harriman and Kennan Institutes, which brought leading Ukrainian literary figures to audiences in North America and made us one of the most outstanding centers of Ukrainian kind of platforms for contemporary Ukrainian literature in this side of the pond. He has recently guest edited a special issue of East-West Journal of Ukrainian Studies that focuses on Ukrainian culture and the Russian aggression that started in Donbass and then became full scale in 2022. And Dr. Andryczyk received in 2022 Peterson Literary Fund Translated Book Award, and was shortlisted for several other international translation awards. He is also the editor, compiler, and the translator of the book that is the reason we are here today. It's called Ukraine 22, Ukrainian Writers Respond to War. And it's my pleasure to give the floor to Dr. Andryczyk.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. So many familiar faces, so many new faces. I appreciate it. Coming to my talk today. What I'll do is first I'll tell you a little bit about how this book came about. Talk about a little bit of what's inside the book, and then I'll read fragments of some of the essays that are in the book so you get a feel for what it is, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. And happy to say that in the last second, the books did arrive from UK, and they will be available for purchase later if you're interested. So a little bit of background. How did this book come about? Well, as we all know, just over 2 years ago, interest in Ukraine because of the horrific war, because of the invasion of Russia, interest in Ukraine just exponentially grew. Yes. And for those of us that work in Ukrainian studies, this was felt especially. Yeah. And in my kind of niche, in what I do within Ukrainian studies, one of the things I do in Ukrainian studies and in the field of translation, as Yuri mentioned, how did we and my colleagues who translate, how did this affect us? Well, we were all of a sudden, we received a lot more interest in Ukrainian authors, where it would be very difficult to try to find a publisher to publish a translation of a Ukrainian author in English. All of a sudden, they were asking, what's going on in Ukraine? Is there something worth publishing? It was quite a stark change to what we're used to. So many more publications of not just Ukrainian literature, but I'll be talking about Ukrainian literature because that's what we're talking about today, but in general, but a lot more publications about Ukraine were put in the works and are coming out now and have been coming out in the last 2 years. So new publications, but also interest in Ukrainian literature would show up for publication in very strange, not just in book form. Like, for instance, a poem that my wife and I had one translated by the wonderful poet Ivan Lolkovich, which happens to be a very short poem that takes place in the Carpathian Mountains. All of a sudden, I got an email from a alpinist magazine, specialists, I don't know if anybody subscribes to that here, but I certainly did not. I'm afraid of heights. But they asked if they could include this poem in this issue, and Ivan gave this okay, and we gave our okay. So all of a sudden, Ukrainian literature is ending up in this very kind of niche form. Art books. A woman who did photographs in Ukraine all of a sudden commissioned Sofia Andryczyk to write an essay especially for the book and asked me to translate it. And this beautiful art book was published with this work by a contemporary Ukrainian writer. What else? Books that had been published, because we had been working in Ukrainian studies and been publishing books, even as difficult it was to get people to publish. And we were doing this in the past, but there was a push to republish things to make them more accessible, oftentimes not publishing them as a hardback academic work that could cost $60, $70 to a soft cover. For instance, years ago, I forget what year, but we published, I think, 2017, a book of essays by Yuri Andryczyk, Ukrainian writer, English translation, My Final Territory, published by University of Toronto Press. Wonderful edition, but all of a sudden they said, hey, we want to publish it, make it more affordable. And they asked Yuri to write an afterword. They asked me to translate it. And so they published it in a much more affordable. So things like that were happening as well, where Ukrainian literature was now appearing in English in all these various places. More specifically to my project here was, Yuri had mentioned that between 2008 and 16, we had this contemporary Ukrainian literature series, which was co-sponsored by the Kennedy Institute in Washington. For all these years, we brought a dozen writers from Ukraine to meet with audiences, and we did everything bilingually. And we ended up getting enough material of translations to publish this anthology, which was published by one of the few presses that were ready to risk and publish something like this. This is Academic Studies Press, so I'm very grateful to them in this beautiful edition, The White Chalk of Days. And this had been an anthology of contemporary Ukrainian literature. So all of a sudden, over 2 years ago, I get an email from Penguin UK asking, listen, we read your anthology, White Chalk of Days, we really love it. We would like to republish it as a Penguin and get the reach out more so people would know more about Ukrainian literature. Would you allow us to do that? And would you write a preface to kind of situate it in today's war? So again, Academic Studies Press were wonderful. They agreed to it, and Penguin published it with my preface as this. So much more affordable in paperback, but basically the same exact book. So things like that were happening, and my colleagues and I that work in this field often thought that, the biggest obstacle we had in sharing our authors and having people discover our authors was the fact that nobody knew what Ukraine was. That was the biggest obstacle, huge obstacle. And thus nobody cared, even if they had heard of it. All of a sudden, because of this horrific war and because all these people are dying and people are reading about it, this obstacle just disappeared. All of a sudden, Ukraine exists, but almost nobody knows anything about it. So this thirst for Ukraine, this need, and that explains why there was this interest in publishing these things. But I always thought, at least, that if that obstacle removed, that our culture, our writers are good enough that once that contact is made, then it's just going to go from there. The important thing was to get past that obstacle. And when Penguin published this, it went around and it got good reception, and then they came back and they said, what else is going on in Ukrainian literature? So I think at least partially I was proven to be right there. So that's where the idea is, what's going on out there right now? These are discussions in March last year or April. And I said, well, there's a lot of things being written, a lot of fantastic poetry is being written, but that's mostly on the internet. It's easily accessible. It's being shared in all these journals. But what about the writers in your book? I said, well, some, been writing poetry, some, not much fiction is being written. People stopped reading fiction. And like a lot of artists in Ukraine, they were forced to write about the war. Everyone. And the genre that was chosen by a lot of the top writers, in addition to poetry, was essay, was nonfiction. Ukrainian writers were bombarded even more than Ukrainianists or Ukrainian scholars, I would think. Well, maybe you can say as a scholar from Ukraine, with Western press asking interviews constantly every day, and they're asking to write articles. What's happening in Ukraine? What are you seeing? What do you think about this? So I got the idea. So for this book of what's happening in Ukraine, to put together a collection of several different Ukrainian writers from different regions of Ukraine, from different generations, written within the first 6 months of the full-scale invasion in February 22. And the idea was to have each of these authors write at least more than one essay within a 6-month period of time, and to group them not according to author, but chronologically. So this way you could kind of, as a chronicle of the time, you could, well, this book now, you could go and kind of see how certain themes pop up among different authors and get put by the wayside, and then another theme pops up, yes? So it's a chronology in that sorts. Now, the idea was to get this published as soon as possible because it was really trying to capture what Ukraine is saying about this horrible experience. So we needed to publish it within 11 months, which isn't easy for translated work. So I enlisted my good friends and colleagues, Mikhailo Naidan and Alla Perminova, who are skilled translators, to help me do these translations. So I did about half of the translations, and they worked as a team for the other half of the translation in order to be able to submit this by the end of 2022. And we did. The book was published. It was the publisher's idea to publish it on Ukrainian Independence Day, and there was a rush to do that, and it did come out in August on Ukrainian Independence Day of last year. So it's been around, I guess, for about almost half a year now. Yes. Now, what's in the book? There are accounts that they're very different, and that's what I wanted. Very different essays. The writers all write. They have their own particular voice, but things range from personal accounts. Like Irina Tsilik writes about her husband, who is a writer who has been serving in the war now, and actually he started serving in 2014. She's recounting how it has affected her family, this war. Sofia Andryczyk wrote 2 wonderful essays about people leaving Ukraine, about refugees, about this mass people. They're heading first to Western Ukraine, to this Lviv translation, and then going to Poland and other places. And she was traveling with them, so she kind of gives us, through her lens, a view of who's in who are these buses with her, going all the way to Portugal. We have writers such as Andriy Bondar, who's a wonderful essayist. He gets into talking about Europe and more of a political aspect of this, and Ukraine and Europe. Writers such as Yuri, a leading writer in Ukraine. In some of his essays, he goes back and this is, I think, really important, and one of the things that's missed the most now, 2 years into this, in discussions of Ukraine, where he reminds us that this didn't just start happening 2 years ago, that there's historical context, that this is a continuing thing. He's actually giving examples of methods that have been used for decades, these same exact methods. And I think that's very important, and that gets passed away. So I'm glad he did that in his essays. Olena Styashkina, a wonderful writer who was in New York last year. She's originally from Donetsk, decided to present her text in a diary form. And as a diary, you get kind of these everyday experiences of living through this war, or things she overhears on the street in Kyiv, because she had escaped to Kyiv in 2014 when Russia began the war then. So those are just some of the things that show up, the various things that show up in this book. Now, having read this book many, many times, and these essays many times, and as editor, you have to read them at least many, many times. So you kind of know them by heart. You start picking up on things that show up very often in these various different essays. And I would just like jot these things down. Oh, there's that again, by different writers in different essays. So, for instance, several writers mention that they slept well on February 23rd. Several writers discuss the shame of leaving Ukraine, whether them or overhearing other people talking about this. Several writers, unsurprisingly, discuss landscapes. Landscapes are referred to very often. Cell phones, very often. And one of these we talk about the language of war, how objects, how Ukrainian language has changed in 2 years, and how certain words have different meanings now than they did 2 years ago. When Natalka Bielitsarkivas was here at Harriman last year, she talked a bit about this. But all of a sudden, you start having constantly these words such as тревожні валізки, or тревожні рюкзаки, or раптові сумки. And they're showing up everywhere. And these are like emergency escape bags, right? Which people would have packed with all their necessary documents, the most necessary things you need to go. And this is showing up like everywhere, which it wasn't 2 years ago. Rafaenko uses it 6 times. Tilik 3 times. Prochasko uses it. Now, in addition to all these themes that I pointed out, these are just some. There are essays that are in this book that don't refer to the war directly also. But they're written in a time of war. So I thought it'd be interesting for the reader to be able to make that connection. Why does Yuri and the Clovers decide to write an essay about Apollinaire's poem about the letter of the Cossacks to the Sultan? Why has he decided to write this in April 2022? So the readers can make these connections, even though he's not writing about the actual invasion that's happening now. Books are mentioned. The fall of the Soviet Union is mentioned. Again, not the war specifically, but this is mentioned. So I wanted that in there too, to also give kind of a sense of what, the people also writing other things, but that the war is present. And Alexander Boychenko actually has an essay about reading during war. And he says, just quote the last line in the essay, where people ask them, what should I read now? What are you reading? What's good to read? What would you recommend? And he says, I have one piece of very simple advice to impart about reading. During the Russian-Ukrainian war, read anything you want. Whatever it is, it will always be about the Russian-Ukrainian war. So again, those essays that don't directly allude to it also touch on it. Okay, so that's kind of the background of what's in here, how it came to be, and to give you a sense of a little bit more of what's in here, I will read several of these essays, just fragments of them. The first one I will read is from the first essay in the book, written by Taras Prochasko. He's a writer based in Ivano-Frankivsk, Ukraine, near the Carpathian Mountains. I translated this one, and the date of the essay is February 24th, 2022. It opens the book. Soon our impressions of war's arrival were transformed into personal stories, told with an individual spin by every person who's able to remember them. From this moment, the morning of February 24th on, everyone will think that they are doing the right thing. People only do that which they can't not do. It's tempting to do what others are doing, but the desire to do things your own way is even stronger. Very soon you will discover that you, nonetheless, did do something wrong. For example, you didn't move the bed where you and your child sleep away from the window, even though you know there's not just explosions, but shattered glass, too, that can scare a child the most. That's the first lesson. Perhaps it will be wise to move it tomorrow. But, firstly, how do you do that without frightening the child? Secondly, whatever happened this morning might not happen again. War is war, but progress ensures that it will always be different from the last time. But here it's reassuring that everything remains the same, that there is no bread for sale, but there is mobile reception. This is very important. Such a huge part of us has been transferred into our phones that if they don't work, we feel like we have lost a part of ourselves. But there's another side to this problem. An uninterrupted phone and internet connection can be exploited in modern war, and terrible things can be done with them to confuse and incapacitate us. In any case, best practice before an apocalypse is to establish alternative ways to contact people you need to be with. Whether you are near or far, you will need to be together somehow. That's Taras Prochaska, an essay that opens the book. Next one I will read for you is by Volodymyr Rafayenko, and I'll have to set this one up also because this one is dated. He wrote this essay April 28th, 2022, but it's set earlier. In other words, Volodymyr Rafayenko was from Donetsk, and he left Donetsk in 2014 when Russia began the war then. And he's explaining that he ended up moving to a dacha, a cottage community outside of Kyiv, where 2022, he once again was surrounded by the Russian army and he had to flee. And in the three essays that he provided for this book, they touch on kind of the similarities between what happened in Donetsk in 2014 and what happened outside of Kyiv. He was near Borodyanka, which everybody knows now, that name, not far from Bucha as well. So it's called Three Springs is the essay. I translated this one. And here he's talking about Donetsk in 2014. Our park was enormous, and even though it was located at the very center of an industrial city with a population of 1 million, it had pheasants. Adults smiled at them, and kids would chase them sometimes without much success. Those birds didn't realize how lucky they were. They were cared for diligently and were a point of pride for everyone who lived in the city. There were other species of birds there too, endless varieties. No one offended them. Everyone fed and watched over them with tenderness. But in spring 2014, the birds' behavior began to elicit some serious questions, at least for me. They started acting very strangely, though they weren't aggressive. They shrieked at me, they escorted me along the paths I jogged on, they jumped at my chest, landed on my shoulders, and basically did not let me pass. One afternoon, my wife and I were strolling through the park and decided to sit on a bench. It was getting warmer. We wanted to relax and warm our faces in the sun. Within just a few minutes, a group of birds had assembled beside us, and a small bird, a starling, I believe, landed right on my knee and began screaming at me. I looked at my wife, she looked at me, and we smiled feebly. Conflicting feelings came over me. Nature was obviously trying to tell us something, but at the time it was unclear what it was trying to say. After some time, I realized it. It was chasing us from our home, trying to save us through these birds. The starling was yelling, "Volodya, Olesya, run away from here. Barbarians are coming, and life will become completely impossible here." On the other hand, the universe was, in a way, using this flourishing to counter the death that was to take over this city, this region, and our blessed steppe within half a year. Hundreds and thousands of deaths would take place here, according to the will of the Russians, who would arrive under the banner of protecting Russian-speaking inhabitants. The tragic irony of all this is that my entire family and I are Russian speakers. At least we were until 2014. But we did not need protection from anyone, not from our fatherland, and not from the Ukrainian language, the first language of both my grandmothers. So that's Volodya. And in later essays, he talks more about what happened outside of Kyiv in the dacha area. I'll read a bit of Yuri Andryczyk's essay. This was translated by Michael Nadan and Alla Firminova. And it's called "Why Does It Have to Be Illich?" And it's dated July 1st, 2022. Yuri Andryczyk. Kyiv is now more or less successfully being de-Russified. Or it might be better to say that it continues with all decisiveness to prepare for de-Russification. They have even proposed to rename Bulgakov Street Kulak Artemovsky Street, the same name that the very man who was deprived of his former presidential rank in disgrace once pronounces Artemovsky. Yanukovych. There are many other non-trivial proposals. I have three personal favorites. The grandfather of fabulous Krylov would be replaced by Matsuo Basho, a brilliant Japanese poet. Fyodor Dostoevsky, an assault on the sacred, would be swapped with the name of the pop artist Andy Warhol, about whom a certain poet once rhetorically asked whether he was a Rusin or a Foucault. The communizing and pro-Soviet to the point of obscenity Romain Rolland would be replaced by another Frenchman. Not a pro-Soviet one, but the inventor of science fiction and discoverer of mysterious islands, Jules Verne, to whom I have given my personal gratitude since childhood. It has gotten to the point where I no longer know which of the streets I would most prefer to live on, Basho, Warhol, or Jules Verne. The streets are streets and city squares are city squares. On the other hand, the National Music Academy of Ukraine, more precisely its leadership, does not want to submit to the trend and is striving to retain its name of Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky at all costs. Instead, among the rebellious lower echelons of the music conservatory, and this doesn't only include the students, the opposite idea predominates. There is no place for Tchaikovsky here. The students are complaining that their opinions are brazenly ignored, and even that threats from the former advisor to the rector have been made. The topic of this renaming, or rather its absence, has, as they say, stirred me, and which is why I will permit myself some further contemplation of the subject. Tchaikovsky is, of course, a first-class musical giant, and inarguably classic, inarguable to the extent that the very phrase classical music evokes his name. And how many times have I, after setting my receiver to the frequency of some classic FM station in the so-called distant abroad, come upon the whispery soft voice of a presenter who up to 100 times a day, tirelessly, and even more whisper softly, utters the name of the enduring Pyotr Ilyich. If classical music has its own pop hits, then Tchaikovsky is the indisputable leader, and pieces from the Nutcracker and Swan Lake are invariably always in the top 10. A certain American musicologist quite correctly summed up Tchaikovsky's creative legacy as a, quote, sweet, light, and easy, extremely sensual treasure house of melodies. In other words, even those who usually struggle to stay awake at concerts of serious music can listen to Tchaikovsky with a certain amount of pleasure, lightly and easily. But is this enough for the National Music Academy of Ukraine to bear his name? There would have to be some other absolutely convincing reason, preferably more than one. For if it's only about genius, then the Academy might as well bear the names of Mozart or Beethoven, Verdi or Gounod, Bruckner, Wagner, Brahms, or Liszt. Only for some reason, it does not bear their names. For some reason, it's Tchaikovsky. That's Yurko's essay on that, and I have two more to read for you. Next one is Olena Styashkina. This is translated by Mikhailo and Alla. And she has two sets of kind of diaries in this book. And this one is entitled, this collection of entries is entitled War Diary, the 4th month of February. And I will read January 25th is the entry here. Oh, no, I'm sorry, June 25th. So Olena Styashkina. Kyiv, June 25th, 2022. The notifications on my phone are stuck. How are you? Is frozen on there. Every 10 days or so, I send them again, then again, and yet sometimes they come to life with a call or a text. But more are frozen now. Each new one is like jumping off a cliff, not knowing for sure what lies below, stones or water. Today I wrote, how are you? To the Zhytomyr region, which was shelled from 4 a.m. from so-called brotherly Belarus. Oi, the phone snapped back. Everything is okay. Everything in general is very good. Check your email. I just sent you a message. I read the message and I'm cutting and pasting it here. Quote, hooray, they hit my apartment. The window, the wall of the kitchen, furniture, dishes, the door to the water closet and to the bathroom as well. I've long wanted to combine them into one room. Are missing. We are in a bomb shelter, but all the same, hooray. Don't worry, they didn't hit my head. Read carefully, I was in a bomb shelter. I went up to my apartment at noon. Our gas is still running. We still have water, but why hooray, you might be asking? They didn't hit their target. They were aiming for a military unit and warehouses, where our people were, along with Western military equipment. The rocket's flight got cut short. Just imagine, everything survived. Everyone is alive. Only my kitchen is damaged. So how are you? Well, that classic. And this I recalled, was it 2 days ago, and that's one of those perfect photos of a blown out building where somebody's closet, I think it was in Kharkiv, was survived within the whole apartment. So you think of these things. Finally, I will read Sofia Andrychowicz's essay entitled Her Story. I translated this one. And it is dated July 28th, 2022. And again, this is about traveling on a bus with people leaving Ukraine. Usually people never stop jabbering on these buses. They fill up with life stories, people sharing experiences of how and when the war entered their lives. A woman from Kharkiv admits that she vomited when she saw Russian tanks right in the street. A woman from the Med complains that she was just finished renovating her house. It had taken her years. She was putting up wallpaper when she was forced to flee her village. A young woman from Vinnytsia divulged that she is the only female member of her territorial defense group and that her boyfriend is very jealous. Are these stories coming from women's mouths different from those voiced by men? Most likely, yes. One can assume that the men's stories would tell the impossibilities of retreating from one's home and what lies behind those impossibilities, about rapidly diminishing options, about sacrificing one's own way of life in order to put that very life and one's own body at risk. They would testify to changes in their mind and transformations of their ego, about redrawing the borders of fear, about the meaning of the words bravery, dependability, dignity, but also hatred, cruelty, and revenge, about what it's like to be a hair away from death, and about death itself. Perhaps the women's stories would be filled with longing for loved ones and would be saturated with fear for their children. They would talk about the silence of empty homes and the anguished, sleepless nights spent anticipating the sound of announcements about rape and violence, about the difficulty and shame of talking about those things at all, and the frustration of rebuilding life within chaos and uncertainty. They would say a lot about love, even more about love and loss, including the loss of the life they once had. The women's stories would also include bravery, hatred, sacrifice, and death, which is always nearby. And the men's would also contain love, great love, and fear and indecision, and sorrow for everything lost. No theme belongs exclusively to women or men. The words themselves can be similar. The only difference is the voice. That's a fragment of Sofia Andrychowicz's. So I will conclude, and then we can get to questions. Sofia mentioned voice, right, at the end. In the last 2 years, many people have been speaking for and about Ukraine. One of the ideas behind this book was to give Ukraine a voice too, make sure the Ukraine's voice is also heard. It provides a view from inside Ukraine, but also because it's being presented by Ukrainian writers. It's showcasing Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian talent. And this is the very Ukrainian culture that is trying to be destroyed, right? That doesn't exist but needs to be destroyed. I've always argued, and many times in this room and other places that I've presented, that our writers, our literature, our culture provides us with nuances about Ukrainian identity, about what's happening in Ukraine, what makes Ukrainians think, why we do what we do. And I'm hoping that this book will do that. The idea was to do it in English, do it with a publisher that can get the book out in various corners of the world. That's Penguin. And after I was done putting the book together, sometimes these things happen by chance, and I swear to you, this is what happened. I ended up putting this together, and I was thinking of essays that were written within the 6 months of the full-scale invasion. And then I looked, and Taras Prochasko's essay was dated 24th February 2022. And the last essay in the book, Irina Tsilek's, was dated August 23rd. August 2022. So it's exactly 6 months. Just happened to do that. But another interesting thing happened. Taras, as you heard, begins his essay, which opens the book with soon our impressions of war's arrival will transform into personal stories told with an individual spin by everyone who's able to remember. So he's alluding to this, writing about this word. And then Irina's essay, towards the very end of her essay, she mentions what the Ukrainian artists are doing, and she says, one of the ways not to become petrified in this time. It's just one of them is to tell stories, and that basically ends the book. So I thought it was kind of interesting that it began and ended with that. So thank you. Hopefully I gave you an idea what this is about and what's in there, and let's hope people like this one, and then we get another offer for another book, Ukrainian literature and English translation. So thank you.
And thank you very much. To start us off with the discussion, I'll pose a couple of warming up questions, and we are being broadcast on the internet. So then I'll open the floor for your questions, and for the questions from all around the world, hopefully. So a couple of years ago, before the pandemic and before the full-scale invasion, we organized an international conference here dedicated to the aspect of the war that had been, without exaggeration, basically ignored, and that is the cultural aspect, the war of civilizations of Russian and Ukrainian culture, and there was cultural responses to the Russian aggression that was localized at that time in the Donbass region. So my question to you is there a difference in how Ukrainian men and women of letters then reacted towards what we try to buy ourselves into believing that it's a localized conflict and not really the war, calling it at all or anything else? And now that this, self-delusion has no place any longer, and we realize that this is the war for our own existence, that this is an existential struggle. Do you see the difference then and now?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, of course. I mean, it's a huge difference. Like I mentioned at the beginning, these people don't want to be writing about war. Some of them in the past have written about, they have written about, imperial Russian Empire, Russification, past events, even present events, what was happening in independent Ukraine in the last 30 years. The difference is now that everybody's writing about it, right? There's very few things. Who was I talking to the other day? I think it was Dostop Slavinsky, and we were talking about, like, I'm getting sick of translating things about the war. I can imagine the writers themselves are sick of writing about the war, I started translating recently something that was written before the war. I was like, but so of course now it's much more prevalent. A lot more people are discovering for themselves, and a lot of people are addressing it, but I think is good because there are different ways of coming at the problem of this attack on Ukrainian culture, right? The more writers we have it with their talents and their particular points of view from various regions of Ukraine and how they came across to this realization, they can add to that discussion. But there are writers that have been dealing with this since day one, in their novels, also in their fiction, not just in nonfiction, but certainly changed very much now.
As a translator, you are giving the voice to Ukrainian literature, but you have to operate in this space between constrained by not one language, but by two languages. A Ukrainian writer would be constrained by her own proficiency in her mother tongue, but you need to kind of negotiate two languages and make sure that the meanings and polysemies of the original language are reflected in the language of translation. So as a translator, what was some of the greatest challenges you were faced with as you were doing this?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I translate usually fiction and nonfiction, some poetry, and usually in combination with other translators. But translating nonfiction is somewhat easier than translating fiction. I must say that. So a lot of things that I encounter when translating fiction were not as much present. But of course, essays, why we love essays so much, or at least why I do, is that essays are nonfiction, but there's always a line of fiction, and the joy of the reader is to see where the authors, especially author like Andryczyk, right? He just will go off, or Rafenko, even what I just read, right? That with the birds and all that. That's fun for the reader to see where he's straying off the factual path. So passing that along with nonfiction is a bit easier, but I've been translating for a while, so and working with these two languages. So I really enjoy translating dialogues. I think that's what I do the best. I basically learn Ukrainian by hanging out in Ukraine and listening to people speak. So I have a particular ear for that, I think, and I enjoy that challenge. That's fun. Other things is, yeah, I mean, you have the source language, you have the target language, and you try to pass along the most important things so that the mood is always very important, the tone. These are very different writers. I mean, Taras Prochaska writes in a very unique style, and his essays could be 2 pages long, but they're so dense, and he kind of jumps around, and his were the most difficult to translate. Other writers were a bit easier to translate. So, different writers had different difficulties, but, it was a challenge working with them. I also, again, working with Michael Naidan and Alla Priminova, we were able to consult also and, ask questions. And, when push came to shove, something really came down to you could ask a writer what they meant, which some would say, oh, I meant this, and gave you a whole page. Some, like Prochaska, said, just write whatever you want. You know what I mean. Okay. And then he'd write that in 3 words. So that's my answer. Yeah.
As somebody who cares about what happens to his work, to translation, can you talk about the reception of translation of Ukrainian literature in the West, other than this exponentially increased need and interest in Ukrainian literature? What has been the critical reception and the popular reception, if you can dwell on that a little bit, readers' reception?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so there was a lot, like, periods within independent Ukraine, right? We're talking, okay, 30 years, around 32 years. So Orange Revolution, there was a little bit more interest in Ukrainian literature, a little bit, but that kind of went pretty quickly, right? And then the Euromaidan, right? Major peak all of a sudden. And you can tell with students signing up for courses, people coming to events, a lot of people got interested in Ukrainian literature that really weren't interested before, because basically, sadly, City Zhadan got beat up, and it was written about in the New Yorker. And he's a really nice guy, and people are like, why would somebody beat up City Zhadan? And then all of a sudden people are into Ukrainian literature. Now we had this moment that I mentioned, republishing books, new publications. So, these books have now come out, they're being reviewed now. So this latest kind of patch that's been produced still hasn't been critically analyzed. Some works have been analyzed, and they've been very positive. That said, I do think that that window is closing. If we were here, if I was giving this talk, let's say in March 2022, we'd probably have to open up that back room And this is a beautiful audience, and I'm very welcome for this, but you know, that is no longer. And then we knew that was coming. But like I said, the idea was the barrier was gone and just get it out there. And I think we've managed to do that. There's more work to be done. Of course, there's more work to be done, but I think the profile of our writers is more than ever before. And you know, we're talking about contemporary literature, but it's also very important about the classics, the Ukrainian classics, for the lack of translations of them. And there's efforts being done to do that as well, to get those out in translation and promote those. It's a lot harder to promote Valerian Pitmohedny because, you know, he was executed by the Soviets in the 30s. It's a lot easier to bring Andryczyk over. But by the way, Andryczyk is coming here, Yuri, and Irina Tsilik. So two writers from this are coming this semester. So I think, you know, there's more presence than before. We're still waiting for a lot of the critical reception, but one positive thing is that major publishers that never would take Ukrainian literature, like this is the first book Penguin ever published that was Ukrainian, unless you count Holland. This is it, which is crazy. You know, it took a war to do that, but so it's more than it was. There are several writers. I think Sofia Andryczyk just signed a deal with Simon and Schuster, I believe, that's huge. There's another one in the works. I don't want to knock on wood say it, so but hopefully soon we'll have a good announcement of another publishing house. That's a big publishing house that's going to take one of our authors. So better than it was, you know, and we'll see how it goes from here. But a lot is coming out, so it's out there, hopefully being read. Maybe hopefully some critical reception is on its way. Yeah.
Excellent. Let's hear questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you. So Marco, I'm glad that you gave me the word right after you're talking about this closing window. So I want you to elaborate on that. As a social scientist, I have the same idea that the interest is kind of diminishing, but at the same time it is transforming into other things, into more long-lasting projects. So maybe that I've been invited right after the invasion, the full-scale invasion. I've been invited to give online. I was stuck in Kiev. I've been invited to give lots of talks online. Then in the second year, nothing like that happened. But I read regularly about some major collaborative projects. So is the dynamic right here? You just mentioned Sofia Andryczyk book project. Yeah. So maybe there will be fewer anthologies, but more individual translations, or maybe there will be fewer translations of writings about the current war, but more of giants like Pitmohedny or something. What's your evaluation of the dynamics?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, certainly. And when I mean this window, and that's what I meant at the beginning, we all knew that this window wasn't going to be open, and the idea was to get it out there. And then anthology is a great way of getting various, not you buy this book today, you may not like every author, but maybe hopefully you like something there that you will then go and say, hey, is that novel translated by this or another book, and go into it. So anthology is great for doing that. But of course, the next step is not just a novel, but let's have a publisher do a series of novels so that somebody can have that. So I think the dynamic is there. I think it's been engaged, and the things are growing, like you said, into something else. The idea was to take advantage of the window as it was then, and I think it was as much as we could. I mean, there was a lot of work also done before in Ukrainian studies, in translation, that was ignored. And that was, again, when I talk about republishing. So it's not like, again, everything just started then and everybody started writing, analyzing Ukraine or showing films about Ukraine or bringing authors over. It's been going on, just few people knew about it. That was the problem. So I think that these efforts should grow into something bigger. And I think that that window was taken advantage pretty well, as much as we could have, I think. But I think you're right, things are changing and transforming hopefully into something else, like you say, like a series or and again, it's very important for classic writers to be done. And the reason I got into translation was because I teach courses of Ukrainian literature, and I wanted my students to be able to read works that aren't translated. That's why I started all this, why I got into it. So on that front, we're much better off. We just started teaching a course. Some of my students are here in contemporary literature, and there's a lot more to choose from than when I started teaching here 17 years ago. So it's that's good. I mean, I think that's good for people to learn about Ukraine. Yeah. I don't know if I answered. Yeah, Maria.
To follow up on that, that was not my question, but I want to say something. It's so true. I mean, like 15, 16 years ago, to offer a course in Ukrainian poetry, maybe there were like 10, 12 books individual by authors. Was your choice.
Yeah.
And now it's so much more. And it's not that Ukrainian literature was not being translated, it was, but it was like for so narrow an audience, right? Not for like as popular as it is now. But what you mentioned about Simon Schuster, it's huge. I think this is, another thing that Ukrainian literature was translated, but who published that, right? Yuri, Q's.
Academic presses.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so this is what is so important, to engage those big publishers, commercial publishers. Only through that kind of stuff you can actually open the window to broader public. Now, my question was specifically about the anthology, or something that you didn't mention, I'm curious about. So these contributions were written specifically for this anthology, or they were previously published, obviously in Ukrainian, because you were talking about translation, or it's a combination?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. I should have mentioned that before. So for this anthology, there was nothing specifically written for this anthology. These were texts that were written for various publications in Ukrainian, various online publications, other places. And we got the rights to publish their translations. I'm trying to think, did any of these? A couple of these essays weren't published anywhere else, but they were not written like specifically for this anthology. They would be lying around, let's say. Yeah, exactly. And my goodness, I should tell you who's in the anthology, shouldn't I? Okay, so we have 9 writers. We have Taras Prochaska, we have Yuri, we have Olena Husseinova, we have Olena Styashkina, we have Alexander Boychenko, we have Irina Tsilik, we have Volodymyr Rafeenko, we have Andriy Bondar. I think that's 9. Yeah, so those are good. And they each have several in here. But yeah, so they were taken from various places where they had been published. It could be Deutsche Welle, it could be Zbruch, various places where they were published.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank you so much for the talk, and also for having me into this anthology. One thing that's really struck me, and especially when you're reading parts of these essays, is the spirit or the attitude that many of them reflect. And obviously the subjects are very grim, are very traumatic, but there's a lot of amusing, almost humorous elements to it. So could you comment on the spirit, or what kind of spirit these essays are supposed to reflect?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't want to generalize here, and I mean, I've heard this before, but good humor is a big part of Ukrainian culture, just to get through some difficult spots in our history. It's just kind of there. But I've several writers that have been visiting North America and here in New York and other places have talked about that. The Styashkina talked about this kind of dark humor that. I mean, really dark. She's the queen of it. She wheels it beautifully. It's a way of coping with it. It's a very good way of coping with it. Of these horrific things that are happening, and a lot of these writers, they write in that way anyway. They would write. That's just their style. Like Andryczyk is always ironic and playful. Same with Bondar and Boychenko. What's that? Rafeenko. Yes, very much so. Yes, thank you. So they would write even if they weren't writing about the war, but now with the subject of war, they're engaging that kind of as a way to kind of get through it. But I'm glad you picked up on that. That's a major, and people have noticed that. How can you be, but it's therapy. It's a way of getting through it, certainly. And many writers have mentioned that.
Actually,
Yes, I was wondering about that question, because sometimes if you pick up you select the essays that are already Ukraine,
Mhm.
or if you commission them for an American audience or from somewhere else, do you think the writers will maybe act differently? Because it's not the same addressing someone that might not have a background in Ukraine or know, the basics, rather than your different, your own fellow compatriots. That's one question.
Mhm.
And the second one is related, since many people will be coming here for the first time to hear about Ukraine, for example, to the events 2 years ago. Do you have any strategy to touch upon certain topics to get out of the way for someone that maybe never read about Ukraine? Or,
You mean, so second question, you mean?
for example, if I come here and I have never read anything about Ukraine,
Mhm.
and would you break the ice, telling me some basic facts that someone that knows about Ukraine will not need to be told?
Yeah, well, okay, I'll answer the second question first. If I understood what you're saying, well, I can kind of go back to when you were asking me about translating. There are two major schools of translators, and we bicker about this all the time, is whether we should use footnotes when we translate, right? For some translators, it's evil incarnate. You cannot have a footnote because it must be formal, it must be the text itself. You don't want to, I'm from the other school because I am a scholar, I'm an educator, and I know that very few people know anything about Ukraine. I am all about, I prefer endnotes so that they're not so intrusive. People can skip them if they want. I've had students read Rafenko's novel I translated. Some have read it without reading the footnotes. Some have read it with the endnotes. Some have read it and so you could do it either way. I'm for, if you have the ear, if you have the platform, you need to inform people, and in some cases for the text to really make sense, oftentimes the humor. Oftentimes some kind of word games you need to, but historical context, all these things, I think they're important. So I think that is part of what we do. Another reason why I think that is important to have this background information is, I think the story that's in these endnotes, the story that tells the story of Ukraine, is as good or sometimes better than some of this stuff that is being written. I mean, it's tragic, it's romantic, it's a fascinating story, and that people don't know about. And if you can learn about the background story of Ukraine in these in these notes, I think that's worth telling as well. I don't know if that answered. Yeah, okay. Then the first question about the audience. Yeah, so these essays were all written in Ukrainian. So except for one, by Irina Tsilik, which she actually wrote in English and I just edited it. The other one she wrote, I translated. So they were written for Ukrainian audience. The one that she wrote in English, it's the last one in the book. It does kind of have more of a background. Like she explains, I think it's in that one. She explains what the executed Renaissance was of the 1920s that readers that maybe do not know about Ukraine should know about. So this is, a whole generation of Ukrainian artists were executed in the Soviet Union in the 30s. And there's a lot of talk these days, like, are we the next, are these people on blacklists? Is this going to happen? God forbid. Should all of Ukraine be occupied? So it's important that is then. So I think that an article like that was written in English does provide a little bit more background, where you wouldn't have to explain executed Renaissance to a Ukrainian, at least not anymore, I hope, right? Maybe 2 years ago you did. Yeah, thank you.
yes, go ahead.
So I'm interested in how your interactions go when you're talking to English language publishers and maybe literary agents about prospective projects. And I'm wondering how much it is people approaching you versus you maybe approaching them. When they come to you, do people have an idea? Have they already done research, and do they have an idea of authors they might be interested in working with or publishing in the contemporary sphere? Or do they come to you and say, what contemporary Ukrainian authors would you recommend to us? What is that dynamic like?
Well, it varies. It varies with each publisher and which publication. In this case, it was kind of a unique because they had asked to republish the book, and obviously they liked it. This book, and then a lot of the writers are in this book, not all, are in here as well. So they were familiar with those writers. They liked them. So when they saw some of the names pop up, you know, they were like, oh yeah. You know, but there are like 4 or 5 writers in here that aren't in here. So there's new ones that, well, they trusted me. You know, and they edit the text as well. They go through and read them as well. But as far as like pitching the book, this was a unique case when they asked me, you know, again, it was that time or the window. Other times, you had to go, like for this book. Michael Naidan and I were at a CEAS conference, I forget where, and we went up to the publisher and said, University of Toronto Press, hey, we're going to translate some essays by Andryczyk. Would you be willing to publish it? And we were able to convince him just on the spot, you know. Did they know about Andryczyk? I mean, U of T Press is pretty well versed in Ukrainian. They've been really great for Ukrainian studies, and they had a great acquisitions editor at the time. They still do, but the one, Richard Ratliff, that used to be there, he was very open to ideas. This was also his connection. Vitaly Chernetsky had a series in Ukrainian literature. Ola Kutuba was working for Academic Studies Press then, and they asked me, do I have anything I wanted to do? So I said this. So it depends. Other places you're asking, you have an idea, and then you do your elevator pitch and you say this, and you provide background information. Like you said, maybe they don't know anything about Ukraine. You have to do this. It really varies by publisher. It's hard to kind of answer one answer.
Yeah, thank you. A little bit your opinion on something. How many years do you think Ukraine will need to kind of establish this point within the world when everybody would say, oh, okay, that's a Ukrainian writer, I know them. For example, a great example is our culture is developing and we're trying to establish that point by movie theater industry, like 20 Days in Mariupol. Or a great example of it is a writer, Ukrainian writer, Vasily Yaroshenko, who was a blind Ukrainian writer who were studying in school for the blind in Japan and became a very popular Ukrainian writer in Japan, and they have like a museum. So how many years do you think we need to establish that kind of point? So the world would know us not only for the work, but for the culture.
How long the war goes on?
Yeah, that's, I mean, a lot is going to determine, you know, how long the war goes on and how it concludes, and, you know, and how Ukraine is going to be rebuilt and what kind of initiatives will be supported. Hopefully there'll be, you know, a lot of energy helping to do this. That would be a huge push, of course. It's really hard to put a number on it. I'm sorry, I don't know. I mean, again, the things that have happened, and you mentioned music and film, and that's a lot easier than literature, right? And just go see who signs up for film classes and literature classes. No offense, but you have a lot more
I
students
think
than I
for a fact,
Yeah. So I think it's
films are more difficult to make.
I know, but people tend to.
Right.
But I think so. I think some kind of what's the word I'm thinking Ukraine, but some kind of breakthrough on that level where everybody's like, wait, this Ukrainian will probably happen, I think, in music or film. But we do have Serhiy Zhadan, who, you know, his popularity, God bless his soul, and he managed to stay fresh and not annoying, even though you see and read about him every day, and he's extremely talented and charismatic, and if he wins the Nobel Prize, which he's probably the best chance for that, I think he'll probably be nominated, right? Would anybody hear anything about that? Marika, nothing? No? Well, I guess
That's
we-
nominated.
That would be huge. So, you know, but But perhaps, you know, we shouldn't wait for the big breakthrough. That'd be great, you know. But you know, we had like Pink Floyd recording songs. We had U2 performing. You know, that's great. But I think, you know, on many levels, it's also important, kind of on a horizontal thing than just the one breakthrough, which of course would be great. But maybe that's a little harder. Maybe it's, you know, because Ukrainian culture is very varied, and you know, and I think the more we present the diversity, the more people you can touch on with that than just maybe one major thing. So I'm sorry, I don't have a year for you, but I really do think it depends on, you know, how things turn out and when they do. But thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What do you think the effects might be of this proliferation of Ukrainian literature, as well as the transformation of our history? I think enough history has already changed by our alignment with the EU and all that. On the restructuring of departments of Slavic studies, where the overarching, dominance of Russia will erode somewhat, and the other cultures can rise up and shine, and so the departments can break up, more equitably distributed. Have you seen any of that?
Well, there's been a lot of talk about it. We just had a whole conference about that in Philadelphia, the big Slavic SES conference. That was the main theme of the conference, was decolonization or decentering of Slavic studies, of this area of studies, Eurasian, Eastern European. So there is a lot of talk about that. There were many, many panels on it. I know Volodya was one panel that I went to, but I went to several. I was actually on a panel too. There are some people who concretely are trying to do something. They really are. I think there are some people that are just in a holding pattern. They're waiting for this to pass and just kind of get back to what was convenient, which is, I guess, human nature, right? If everything was kind of lined up without Ukraine, why change it? So it's kind of a holding pattern. But I do think there are some meaningful steps being made, and some changes will happen as a result of this. I really do. I just don't think it's going to be on a mass scale that maybe many of us would like. A lot of it comes from, I think, what the students require. If students are asking for more courses on Ukraine, for more various Ukrainian European subjects, then I think departments would have to respond. It can't just come from one side. It kind of has to go in tandem. So some changes definitely, but not on a mass scale, I think. But again, we'll see, it's still discussed in our circles very often. Yeah.
It's a slow process.
It's a very slow, again,
There is a lot of resistance, definitely.
yeah.
Those who benefit from center in Russia would oppose the center in Russia, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Laura?
In that same vein, so obviously you have this new generation of students and youth, both inside Ukraine, who are really, I think now, especially understanding the importance of speaking Ukrainian, propagating, Ukrainian culture, teaching their peers about it. And of course, you have students here in the West, in Europe, who kind of act as disciples of.
I don't know what I heard. Little visitor on the floor.
Oh, no.
Eliminated. Cockroach. Yeah.
Just,
Okay.
Oh yeah, and here in the
Students,
West,
yeah.
in Europe, you have sort of, disciples of, the teachings of professors, of academics. What do you think is the role of students and youth, especially now in a moment where, spreading information about Ukrainian culture and learning about it is so informative and important?
So both students in Ukraine and here?
Yeah.
Well, it's huge. It's enormous. Like I said, it's just sharing information, just knowing if we're focusing on youth, it's a cliche, but youth know how to share things better than the older of us. I am horrible in social media and stuff like that. I'm just non-existent. But so, and that's always looking forward and kind of on the edge. So it's an integral part of it. Without that, it's not going to work. What has changed in our field is we have a much larger audience. Ukrainian culture has a much larger audience in Ukraine itself, which is extremely important. This was very difficult to kind of break through, but now there are people that are really Ukrainians, young Ukrainians, who are interested in Ukrainian culture and opening up for themselves. They're like, oh, he's incredible. Why didn't I never know about this? And that's a wave that's unstoppable, I think. I mean, that's always been a big problem. And there are very mechanisms set up so that, people were not informed of this or was presented in horrific ways that you would just run away screaming from Ukrainian culture because it was presented in these horrible ways in Ukraine. I think that has changed, and that's a game changer. I think it's very important, especially for young people involved.
just a very quick question. Is your book available in Ukraine?
It is in my closet where I have all the essays printed out that I translated. They're a mess. No, these are all no, it's not available in Ukrainian, but the essays that were translated are available in Ukrainian. And I do, in the back of the book, there are acknowledgements that tell you where the essays were first published, and I think all of them are online. So you can see how bad a translator I am, but I don't want to hear it.
Yes, Alice.
I was wondering, has there been any interest in publishing the anthology in other languages?
That's a good question. I know that other languages have been publishing these authors. I'm not sure about if any of these particular essays have appeared in different languages besides English and Ukrainian. I don't think so. For most of these, making this book a lot easier, because one of the things as an editor, as a compiler, you have to do is you have to get the rights to everything. And I really lucked out because most of the authors own the rights. So it was just a matter of talking to them. So they, I guess, have the rights. I don't know what they ended up giving Penguin as a result. So I don't know if these could be published. I think it's English language rights is what is retained by the publisher. But a lot of these authors have been publishing their essays and other literary works in various languages. French, there's been lots of anthologies coming out in some languages that Ukrainian literature hasn't reached before. Yeah.
Another question?
Yes, go ahead.
So did you mention some of the authors have written in past predominantly Russian?
Two of the authors in this anthology wrote in Russian until 2014. They're both from Donetsk and they both escaped when the war there began.
So the question is, now they're writing in foreign language, which is worldview. Did you notice a difference in either their language in Ukrainian or the themes that they bring up or certain preoccupations or something different in their writing compared to the authors who wrote in Ukrainian?
Yeah, well, Olena Styashkin, I haven't translated. There was her works here were translated by Mikhailo and Alla. Her novels have been translated by other translators. They are available in English. So I've never translated her texts. I have translated Volodymyr Rafeenko, another writer, extensively. Besides the novel Montegreen, there's a play of his, and I'm translating his most recent novel now, plus the 3 essays that are in here. The things he writes about are definitely things that are addressing somebody that has recently made that switch. He addresses it directly. The language, more so in the novel than here, is, and I write that in my introduction to Montegreen, is very playful, and he plays with this idea of writing in a language for a first time. That's part of the beauty of that novel, and he plays with that idea. Like I said, using Klichnia, the evocative case, or diminutives, things like that. In the nonfiction, less so, but definitely thematically that's picked up. And Olena does write it also. I didn't translate her, but she, in these essays and these diary entries, she does that as well. And in her prose, in her fictions, yeah.
So in your informed estimation, or probably you know it, how many more or less professional translators from Ukrainian into English are there?
A lot more than there were 2 years ago.
Which is what?
And a lot more than there were 10 years ago.
20, 25?
Oh no, there's more of us. Into English only?
Into English,
20, you said?
yeah.
Professional? I mean, there have been a lot of people just translate, kind of on the fly, like in the internet and stuff like that. Which was very helpful, with disseminating. Probably.
On the fly.
Yeah. I don't have a number again, but it certainly has grown. Let's not forget that there is a whole generation of Ukrainians that have lived in the West for a while now, whose English is almost native. And that's a whole crop of, I think, new translators that now a lot of them have just been kind of reawakened to their Ukrainian background and to the Ukrainian language, or have just now discovered the Ukrainian language. Maybe they're wonderful writers in English. And so I think we should be on the lookout for that as a new batch is coming. Among my colleagues, there seems to be more every time. I just look at things being published more and more every year. There seems to be another 5, I think, of published translators that I know of, and probably another 10 that I don't know of, you know.
And
So-
as far as you are concerned, what is your next translation project?
Well, the one that I don't want to jinx is a major one, and hopefully I can announce it soon. But the other one is I'm translating.
Announce it soon as completed or?
Oh, no, no,
Oh.
no, no. Getting a publisher, signing a contract. No, I'm translating Volodymyr Rafeenko's novel now, his latest novel called Petrikor, The Ascent of the Earth After Rain, which deals with also some kind of autobiographical issues, but of his past, but it's less playful than Mondegreen. It's dealing with the war like 100%. It's dealing with death. It's trying to deal with death, trying to kind of figure out how do we get through this and around this and what's after, which a lot of the writers are writing about right now. Death is just, that's what's happening. It was published in Ukrainian. The novel was, yeah.
Okay, we'll take the last question. Anybody who didn't have a chance? Go ahead.
No, there was a question about translations of this essay in other languages. So I will venture a more general question. So, until recently, translations from Ukrainian into English lagged well behind translations into German and Polish, especially. Yeah. So how now, as far as you know, you might not have the full information, but is English kind of catching up with this new interest in this global outreach? It should be logically, yeah.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I never thought of it, Volodya. But I'm starting to think right away 2 things. Yes, in like the 90s, when with Ukrainian independence, Polish was the first language translating at least the newer authors. And then after that, Germany picked it up because of that. So they were way ahead, always. I don't think they stopped because of the war, so they're still way ahead, English is still kind of catching up. That said, there are a lot more things that haven't been translated in English that have already appeared in Polish and German. Like Oliver Andryczyk has been translated in Germany. His agents is German, right? The same thing. So there's a lot more catching up to do. So maybe English is going to have more translations to fill that gap. But at the same time, I don't think those have stopped. I think interest in Ukrainian literature has also increased in those languages, but also new ones have appeared. So we're still there. I mean, but I think those are, ahead of us. Yeah. Probably we're ahead of Russian translations of these works, though.
Yeah, that definitely look like it.
All right, well, thank you very much for this and for
Yes.
what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming on the chat.
There are books to be purchased there at the back, and traditionally we have announcements to make. I wanted to remind you that on the 31st of January, we have a screening of the war drama Bucha with a filmmaker in attendance. You will be able, some of you might have attended the discussion with him of the project in progress. Now the film has been finished and it's kind of touring the United States and Canada. And on the 31st in Deutsches Haus, we're going to have an event screening Bucha and discussing it with the filmmaker, Alexander Stur. Then on the 20th of February, and you won't, those of you who care for Ukrainian film, it's probably going to be the first such occasion. We're going to host Alla Zahaikevich, a very well-known and internationally celebrated Ukrainian film composer. She's going to be here. We have already an agreement with her, so mark that in your calendars. And those of you who would like to attend our events, please approach and leave your email so that we could put it on our mailing list so that you don't miss anything exciting. We have a very a rich program of events. Thank you again.
On the 30th, there is a presentation on Ukraine. January the 30th.
Yeah, the website already has several, the Harriman website that has several events already posted. So please consult. as
What
well.
book presentation?
Presentation, Ukraine Patron of Democracy.
Right, there are many other things too.
I mentioned that.
I could have mentioned many other things.
Yes, yes, yeah.
Thank you.